to Behaviorally Speaking, Leadership for Changemakers, the podcast where we explore how behavior shapes leadership. I'm your host, Dr. Esther Bob, and this episode is brought to you by Esther C. Bob ABA Services. Today, I'm joined by Shannon Fitzpatrick Thomas, a licensed professional counselor and systems leader whose 34-year career spans residential, inpatient, and outpatient care, county human services leadership, and higher education. Shannon helped bring trauma-informed care into government offices, communities, and schools in Delaware County. Now in private practice at LPC Counseling Services in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. She also teaches trauma and behavioral health courses at Immaculata University and Eastern University, where I also am an adjunct professor. Shannon offers powerful lessons about purposeful trauma-informed leadership and human behavior. Let's dive in. So Shannon, thanks so much for joining today's conversation. I'm so happy to see you. It's been a minute, but nevertheless, once you're in the field, you're always in the field, and you always get the opportunity to reconnect. So I'm happy you're here today. How are you feeling coming into today's conversation?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you again.
Yes.
I'm really excited. Truly overjoyed to speak about trauma-informed care and the growing understanding that systems themselves can either reduce trauma or unintentionally reinforce it. I really like speaking on those two areas. So I'm excited to kind of explore how toxic stress impacts organizations, leadership, and workplace culture, but also to discuss opportunities about like creating responsive systems that support regulation, resilience, and meaningful organizational change. So thank you again for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I'm very excited you're here. I'm feeling, eager to learn what you're going to share, just because the topic we're talking about is one that's so important. And, I'm eager to learn from you, with all of your wealth of experience in private practice as professor, all of that jazz, and take away insights that I can then implement, for myself, but also with my staff and organizationally, as you said. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So Shannon, why, from your perspective, do you believe this conversation we're talking about today, trauma, toxic stress, responsive systems, right? Why are they foundational for regulated leadership for us as change makers?
Well, I think it's important to understand that leadership is not only about strategy, it's about regulating human nervous systems inside complex systems. Many of us work in all different types of organizations, and it's not just about the organization itself, but it's also about the workforce and those that we serve, and how we can make sure that we're understanding that all of those, the workforce, those that we serve, the organization, the leadership, we all have stories, right?
Yeah.
Our employees have stories, our customers, those that we serve have stories, the students that we teach have stories, and we have to really understand that within those stories comes opportunities to support healing versus hurt. And, trauma and toxic stress shape how people interpret feedback, how they respond to authority, how they tolerate change. And without this lens, leaders often, mislabel stress responses as performance problems. I've seen that in my career. It can, escalate harm while trying to improve outcomes. As change makers, we must understand that systems either stabilize people or re-traumatize them. So the theory of system-induced trauma definitely is an issue there.
Yeah.
Trauma literacy gives leaders a shared language for naming what people are experiencing without blaming individuals. So it really shifts the leadership from performance correction to capacity building, right? It helps leaders recognize that culture change fails when nervous systems are not ready for change. And so there's a lot of organizational structure that needs to occur when organizations are moving towards becoming trauma informed. And it's a process. It's a journey. It's not a destination.
Yeah. I love everything you said. And one thing that stood out to me is trauma literacy. I talk a lot about trauma informed, trauma assumed. I mean, obviously I understand the concept, but never really heard the phrase. So I appreciate that. And, it's something that I strive towards. You also mentioned like system induced trauma. Mm-hmm. And I always want to be so careful, Shannon, that, we're not perfect. I'm not perfect, but that I'm not knowingly or unknowingly, triggering trauma or, re-triggering trauma for anyone that I work with. So I try to just stay cognizant, always, wanting to learn more about trauma and learn more about the people that I work with, the people that I support, even those in my life, Shannon.
Sure.
And make sure, that I'm not doing anything or I'm not responsible. And if I were, and then I find out, then that, I'm apologizing, right? And hoping to learn more. So I really appreciate that term trauma literacy. I'm going to hold on to that, because to me, it just shows a vested interest in not only learning more about it, but really understanding it, right? And being able to function as leaders in our environments and be supportive. So having said all of that, Shannon, and all of the rich information you've shared so far, what do trauma-informed, I just mentioned them, and then trauma-assumed mean for us as leaders? What do they mean for us from our perspectives?
I think it's important to title that as trauma-informed leadership. That's for me, that's a very important word. When leaders are trauma-informed, they recognize trauma is common. They're able to use more of a trauma lens in their practices on the daily, but also, in larger leadership types of, situations, hiring practices, policies, communication, expectations of the workforce. Yeah. Also, one area in there is so important is the structure of trauma-informed supervision. That goes so far when you're working with individuals to have that, one, awareness of the importance of having a trauma-informed philosophy in your supervision as a leader, as an administrator, as a director, a CEO. Because when you're providing that trauma-informed supervision, you're looking to continue healing others and not hurting them through your leadership. And, I always use those words, hurt and heal, because we have a choice here as leaders, as, members of a full workforce, is how we engage and interact with others is either going to hurt or heal them. Yeah. And that's really the underpinnings of trauma-informed care is trauma's healed through relationships. Yeah. And so when leaders have the ability to instill in themselves, but also in their workforce and other supervisors underneath them to do the trauma-informed supervision, it really creates that vision of being able to become fully trauma-informed organization.
Yeah, I absolutely love that idea of trauma-informed leadership, trauma-informed supervision, actually. Because it just makes me think of like check-ins or one-to-ones, with staff, or even, small group or large group meetings, and the different emotions and beliefs and opinions. Or it might just be someone is having, a personal dilemma, right, that I'm not aware of. And then we see different responses, different reactions, different emotions, sometimes heightened tone, things like that. So keeping that in the back of my head moving forward, I think will be helpful not only to me, but to those that I lead and supervise. But then I also love that you kind of just summed it up foundationally as heal or hurt. Heal or hurt, right? It's either we're doing one of those things, and how can we really focus on concepts like realizing that trauma is real, recognizing, that someone could be experiencing trauma. Then how do we respond? But as you said, Shannon, how to resist re-traumatizing, right? Those that we serve. And I think I really like that concept of heal or hurt, and just like keeping those two words in my mind, I think would be helpful. And it's good knowledge to share with others as well. So I think of, just my own experiences, Shannon. I think of experiences of others that I support, and, constantly we hear the words trauma, but then we also hear toxic stress, right? So what do they mean in layman's terms, Shannon, for our listeners? And how do they differ from everyday workplace stress? Are they truly different, or are there similarities and overlaps?
Well, I like to look at trauma. It's what happens when stress overwhelms a person's ability to cope and to feel safe, right?
Okay.
It's not usually defined by the event. It's defined by the body's capacity at that time to be able to take in the event that's going on or the interaction. And we know from, data and experience that two people can experience the same situation and have very different nervous system outcomes.
Yeah.
Not everybody's alike, even in the context of families or siblings. They may be reared the same way, but their nervous system may respond differently. And so we know, it's really important to also understand what toxic stress is also, not just the trauma piece. Yeah. But toxic stress in organizations can be long-term, unrelieved stress without enough support or recovery. And that can also mean in the context of the organization, leadership, or the environment. We know everyday work-related stress usually has a beginning and an end. Yeah. And our nervous system can usually reset. But trauma and toxic stress together, it really keeps that body in the survival mode long after that event is over. So if an organization or individuals in that organization are not trauma informed, and individuals who have those stories are still going into the work environment on a daily basis and hitting some levels of toxic stress or being traumatized, the workforce, their nervous system's not going to be able to regulate or reset. And then as leaders, we're in trouble. Right. And we know if our workforce is not regulated, not working from the front part of their brain, if they're coming in the back part of their brain and working out of the brainstem, we know that there's a possibility that they're then going to be engaging those that we serve or teach from a stress response versus a regulated response.
Yeah. It makes me think, Shannon, listening to you, I had a conversation with a colleague yesterday for this podcast, but one of the things I talked about was setting boundaries and buffers, right? Because sometimes we overextend, we overreach, or, we have so much going on. So that's something I told her I was, working on for myself, but also really sharing, what you said in that message with others, right? So that they can do it too. Because, in the workplace environment, there's so much pressure and so much stress sometimes. Like there's a deadline, there's this compliance issue, there's, we're being, going through monitoring from the state or whatnot. So there's all kinds of things. And then how do we regulate and how do we respond? So saying all of that, Shannon, I think of words like flight, words like fight, words like freeze, and words like fawn. And, what does that look like in organizations, Shannon, and how can, when we're faced with stressful situations in organizations, how can we approach, whichever response? I mean, I know in the moment it's like one just happens, right? But what are your thoughts in terms of organizations?
I mean, it's a great question. I really do think, as a leader, director, whatever the leadership position is, we have to be aware of how our workforce or those that we're supervising are presenting on a daily basis. And sometimes we may see staff come in supervision or in staff meetings or even in email responses, looking or we're perceiving them as being defensive. They may be engaging in conflict escalation. Or some of the directors may be presenting as micromanaging or being more controlling in their leadership style. And so that fight response, we have to be fully aware of that. And not just, when we're teaching students or teaching others, even in my private practice, to deal with stress and brain regulation, is we always tell them, let's build in some distraction techniques so that you're having a thought and you're not going right to the behavior. is building some capacity for time and space.
Yeah.
So that they can lead from regulation. And so when we're seeing staff engaging in those behaviors, quote unquote, we can't jump to conclusions, right? We have to say, maybe there's an alternative reason why they are acting in such a manner, like in that fight mode. Similar also to flight. We can see high turnover, absenteeism.
Right.
Yeah, like, you know how it goes. Organizations that are constantly restructuring.
Yeah.
Staff that are, emotionally withdrawn. These happen in all levels of organizations, from education to local government, private, organizations, community-based organizations, volunteer organizations. And then to your other 2 points, the freeze and the fawning. We start seeing individuals who usually spoke up a lot, right? In the meetings. Now they're silent. They're not speaking.
Yeah.
They're doing compliance without engagement. They're just, moving along, like that quiet quitting a little bit is that term we've heard recently.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you can also see individuals in that fawning stage, also that trauma response. That's a new term to us. That people pleasing, individuals avoiding honest feedback, lack of those healthy boundaries that you were talking about are so important. And so staff can cycle in and out of that. So we can too as leaders, and we have to be aware of it, and we can't judge right away. We have to provide opportunities for ongoing discussions and integrating that trauma-informed supervision and opportunities for self-care and creating that safe environment for our workforce to thrive. It's so important.
Yeah, I love everything you said. One word that stuck with me is distraction. And I like how, one word can be used in so many ways and mean different things. But so like recently, I've been listening to an audiobook and it talks about like, being present and avoiding distractions, right? But you use it in a way in the opposite that makes sense, like distracting in the moment. So we take a pause, right? To analyze and think, might this be a trauma-induced response? So, if, for example, the staff member is constantly apologetic, is it fawn? Is it trauma-induced rather than, as you're saying, holding off, avoiding judgment? So I like that. And a lot of the things you said really make me think, even like, the quitting as the flight, and so not taking staff responses or anyone's responses personally, but sort of really digging deep into ourselves to try to understand first and foremost why this is happening, but then to have the conversation with them, right? You mentioned safety earlier, having safe spaces so they feel free and open to be candid and, share their experiences and their thoughts and feelings. So I think those are all things that I'm definitely going to consider. I really, like I said, love the concept of, just a distraction in the moment to sort of, I guess, calm ourselves down a bit and just kind of think deeper about what's happening. But saying all of that, Shannon, you talked about, some staff, the flight might be leaving, right? The job finding something else. For others, it might be they freeze, they're stuck there. And so what happens to us neurologically, Shannon? I mean, I've been in situations before, different organizations, different workplaces, different situations where, it was traumatic for me. It was stress induced for me. And then I had to make a decision. Am I going to stay in this environment or am I going to leave? And so what happens to us, Shannon, if we decide to stay, whether it's a leader, whether it's a staff member, whatever a position, if we stay in traumatic situations and toxic stress environments for too long, what really happens to us?
Yeah. And so in my experience, being an administrator, being a clinician, also working in my early career in a residential treatment center in leadership, you start seeing like your own brain or your workforce, staff's brain, like it becomes like optimized, for threat detection, right? Instead of strategic thinking. And so staff walk into work, as I mentioned earlier, in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. So when you start thinking about the impact of secondary traumatic stress, toxic work environments, individual staffs or even ourselves, our emotional reactivity increases. So if we're leading from the the release of the cortisol and adrenaline, our body's already in a stress response. Our heart rate's up. Our breathing may be shallow, our blood pressure's up. And so if we're expecting to work with somebody or teach somebody or supervise somebody, we're not in a good headspace. So those executive functioning skills that we talk about, like memory, flexibility, activation, maintaining focus is really affected, and we're not at our best. We know when we're here, we're at our best in the front part of our brain. And so leaders, may be more prone to defaulting to control, oversimplifying problems, resisting innovation. And then, if the threat is seen as a chronic threat, it really narrows our attention as leaders to short-term outcomes. We're looking at dealing with more immediate risks versus a long-term. And so that long-range strategy and systems thinking required, we have to have a regulated nervous system. And in the absence of that, we're not going to be productive. We're not going to be able to support our workforce. Staff's not going to be able to engage with those that they're teaching or serving. And so, overall, our executive functioning and our ability to do our job well is impacted because our mind-body connection is off.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Like, we can't be our best, right? And I'm always about, supporting people to be the best that they can be. And so if we're dysregulated, we remain too long in traumatic situations, stress-induced situations, whether it's at work or in our personal lives. To me, what came to mind, Shannon, is that we're more likely to make errors, right? And in our field, errors can be costly, right? Depending on what it is. They could also cost us our job. So we have to really make a decision as to whether or not we remain. And if we choose to remain, how are we addressing it? Like, how are we letting our superiors know, our supervisors know, like this is how I'm feeling. This is what's happening. And I think of, our fields now are so urgency, or normalizing urgency. Like, this has to be done now, and then really thinking more about giving people time to breathe and think through what they are doing instead of rushing. So that pause. Saying all of that, Shannon, as a leader, you're a leader, what are some key exemplars we should be looking for, right? So trauma or stress response systems we should be able to recognize immediately in those that we lead.
And I always say I've done a lot of trainings in my career on trauma-informed organizations. I always say it behooves an organization to become trauma-informed. And I always get questions, well, how does it really overly impact an organization to change the culture, to want to, engage with each other in a trauma-informed manner? And, some of those long-term reaches, goals, or successes of integrating a trauma-informed care culture is increase in performance of the workforce, compassion, satisfaction. Employees want to come to work. They're not having chronic absenteeism, so they're not calling out. They're taking on more responsibilities because they're happy to be there. In the absence of that, we see sudden drops in performance, even after feedback or conflict, staff emotionally shutting down or withdrawing, heightened irritability or defensiveness, that fight, flight, or freeze or fawning increases. And sometimes individuals even, they continue to engage in overworking, right? Some individuals become, they don't want to leave the work area because they're so worried about what's going to happen when they're not there. They want to be there to feel as though they can kind of control the narrative or the environment. And so then they're engaged in, an inability to rest and to integrate self-care. And so they're not coming to work here regulated, right? They have difficulty concentrating, completing their tasks. And so, it behooves an organization to want to integrate these, trauma-informed care principles, because then they're, off to recruiting employees coming in, knowing it's a stable, regulated environment versus one that's unpredictable, and not feeling safe. There's a need for that psychological safety for employees to have. And you know that, I know that. We've seen it. We've seen it not happen in our careers, and that psychological safety is so important. I remember when I was supervising a team of individuals, I did a lot of the trauma-informed supervision, and the staff really appreciated that. I integrated a lot of the, aspects of, trauma-informed care, like building in trust, the safety. I probably overdid it a little bit. I would always just try to protect them from what was going on in the larger capacity of work of the organization, so that I was taking it on, and not letting it hit them, because I knew that they're the ones integrating, our work with those that we serve in the community or at large. And I wanted to protect them. And that was me. That probably was a little bit of fawning or a trauma response myself. But, we sometimes need to do that. So,
You gave a lot there. I love that response. Words that stood out to me were psychological safety. I heard self-care, right? And again, coming back to the concept of, trauma-informed supervision, I really think I'm going to start, incorporating some of what you just shared, like in some of my one-to-ones and check-ins with staff. But everything you said, so things like psychological safety, things like self-care, how does the impact then of trauma physically affect our bodies, Shannon, and our brains, right, in our leadership positions?
And also, not just the leadership positions, but our staff. So in those stories that our staff have, who our leaders have, who we have our own stories. And with that, there is that physical impact to our brains and our bodies, like you mentioned. And the more we're back here, and this is what I always do with my clients, the more we're in the back part of our brain, those elevated stress hormones, they're going to disrupt our sleep, digestion, even our immune functioning. We have a lot of trauma-informed champions like Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, Bruce Perry, and others that really talk about how the nervous system becomes less flexible, slower to recover if that cortisol and adrenaline continues to pump out over time. I've seen individuals struggle with chronic fatigue, headaches, migraines, gastro problems, but also that emotional numbness and volatility, that can really lead to, long-term psychological problems, or even turning to substance use, right? And so we have to be aware that, toxic environments, it doesn't just end there. It's also what our workforce are bringing to their jobs every day. And we can have a part in helping them heal versus hurting them. So that's why it's so important for organizations to become trauma informed. We just don't know what people are walking in to the office with every day. And we have to create that little bubble to provide that opportunity to help them regulate their nervous system.
You made a good point. You said we don't know what people are walking in to work with every day. 100% agree. And it makes me think, Shannon, of like unresolved trauma. So whether it's unresolved trauma in our personal lives, from our historical experiences, or in the work environment, how does unresolved adult trauma really impact our executive functioning, and our leadership decision making?
Right. And we kind of talked about that earlier too, is, what is stress and, the trauma responses do to our body. You hit the nail on the head. It exactly hits those executive functioning skills. I mean, being able to competently, execute, initiation of a task, sustained focus, memory, And so sometimes in leaders and in our workforce, we'll see individuals having difficulty prioritizing and sequencing complex tasks, or even simple tasks, right?
Right.
I've seen individuals overreacting to small disruptions in the environment. So, like something small could happen, like even a pin drop, and now the reaction is so huge.
Yeah.
And so that sometimes as a leader, you have to say, wait a minute, that's not a typical response over a pin dropping. And so that gives us an opportunity to try to build that capacity for that time and space to kind of help them regulate. And so there's, with trauma-informed care, or even with trauma, I always use that word. There's always opportunity here. Being able to help others, regulate or build some skill sets in the workforce, or personally. Other areas that I do see workforce leaders, struggle with their executive functioning is avoiding necessary but emotionally risky decisions. So a lot of avoidance behaviors, definitely see that. Even avoidance in, even answering emails or voicemails, and simple things, just, it's like silence.
Yes.
I think we've all seen that. It's like, why are people responding to my emails? And so to find out they're leaving because they just couldn't handle it. And so it makes sense in the long run, but these are some of those initial signs. Their distress tolerance is affected, kind of like they can't, handle that little pin dropping, increase in emotional states. I've seen, staff crying, being a little bit more emotional, tearing up over, even interacting with, individuals, and hearing their stories. And so, that distress tolerance is definitely affected. And I also think that for leaders, since we're focusing on that, sometimes they may confuse urgency with importance. Leaders may become highly productive, but not highly strategic. Right. So they look like they're producing a lot, but they're really not building the capacity for developing or implementing strategic plans at a higher level. And so we sometimes seeing, that survival strategy. So they may look like they're okay and they're present, they're showing up, but they're really shut down inside. And we're not, they may look like they're coming to work and they're being productive, but it's just not happening.
Listening to you share all that information, I'm like, Shannon, you might as well go ahead and invoice me. This is like my little therapeutic session, because I'm listening to you, but I'm thinking of, how I've observed some of the examples you gave in staff, but like sitting here, I'm like, ooh, some of those things I've done myself. And so, I think often, as care, in our caregiving positions, we're often nurturers. We're often looking after everyone else, sometimes not ourselves as much. But that was just a good lesson for me, because I sat there and I'm listening, and several of the examples you gave, like things like, delayed responses to emails, things like that, right? I know there are sometimes I myself engage in those behaviors, and it's making me think, are they trauma-induced responses? So like really always thinking of myself, how it impacts me, but also those that I serve. So in all of that, Shannon, we work with such vulnerable populations, right? For a number of reasons, special needs, psychological, psychiatric needs, minorities, and the list goes on. What's the danger, Shannon, in ignoring trauma, right? In ourselves and in our professional systems, in our organizations, when we're serving such vulnerable populations who really needs us to be present, keep them safe, and they're trusting that we can, make their lives better.
Yeah, that's probably the most important question we have today, is because that 3 words, trauma-induced, or system-induced trauma, system-induced trauma, is if we're not recognizing the pervasiveness of trauma in our organization, in our workforce, it's going to translate to harm to those that we're serving, those that we're teaching. And I can give you an example, like say a secretary answering the phone for a department, and I just came from a domestic violence situation at home. and I'm completely dysregulated, and the individual on the phone is asking me a simple question and I overreact. I end up screaming because I'm misinterpreting what they're saying, or they may have made a comment like, I don't understand what you're saying, or you're not being too polite. And then I'm hanging up on them.
Yeah.
The systems are built, and organizations, companies, they're built to help others usually, right? They're providing a service. And if the service is not providing that trauma-informed perspective or interaction, then we're doing more harm.
Yeah.
Because we have to always have the perception of a universal precaution of trauma. We have to assume that everybody we're talking to, everybody we're engaging with may have had or is going through trauma. And so that universal perspective of individuals having trauma shifts us from saying, what's wrong with you, to what has happened to you. And that's really the importance motto or philosophy for organizations to have, so they avoid that system-induced trauma. Because when we're able to say what's happened to you, we feel more empathetic. We're not personalizing things. It's not about us. It's about providing that safety bubble, that welcoming, hello, how are you? And creating that trauma sensitive space, so that individuals who may be suffering in silence are, receiving the information they need to get the help that they're coming for from us.
Yeah. What's happening to you instead of what's wrong? That's an important point. And it's very, it could make the difference, just as you're saying, right? In the response of someone, and it takes us away from assumption. You also talked about, doing no harm. And I think of just core ethics, right? As professionals, we're expected to engage in behaviors and benefit others and do not harm them. And if we're not addressing trauma and we're harming, then essentially we're not living up to our obligations as professionals. So it also makes me think, Shannon, of power imbalance in organizations and, or traumatic responses to that. So I remember being in situations where I'm, depending on who it is, my heart is already skipping a beat, because of that imbalancement or that, the micromanagement, right? Things like that, or, where it's like this person is in charge and you must follow, those kinds of things. And how does that power imbalance in organizations, Shannon, amplify trauma responses?
Well, I think, unfortunately, when organizations have that imbalance of power, I think sometimes at that top level becomes a group mentality. And that just fuels the reactions of the workforce for everyday questions, needs, situations. And so it really blocks the ability to have a healthy organization. Because we know if the bosses, those that have power, those that are leading these organizations or companies, are, utilizing their power to hurt others, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, because they can, there's that imbalance. That power activates survival memories tied to authority, punishment, and control of the workforce. Perhaps, like I said, our workforce has their own stories. And so it can really trigger these, early childhood adversities that our workforce have went through, other midline supervisors have went through. And if trauma-informed care is not coming from the top down, it will result in system-induced trauma. I've also seen lack of trauma-informed care at the top, but start at a mid-level management. It can work a little bit, and it helps to avoid that imbalance of power. But again, those mid-level admins or supervisors, directors are then taking the imbalance on their shoulders. And so their allostatic load becomes heavy. Their distress tolerance becomes very low. And then it's not sustainable. And so when leaders hold unchecked power, Usually this is the norm or culture, as I mentioned, from the top down.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of lack of accountability, willingness to address it. It hurts. It doesn't heal the organization. It just perpetuates the pervasiveness of trauma in the workforce. And then like we spoke about earlier, it pushes our workforce into the fight, flight, freeze, or fawning. And, I always take a step back and I'm like, it is just unbelievable that an individual walking into work one day can force somebody to go from here to here by a simple look, a simple comment, an email, a look, and just by their presence. And I've seen it and I've experienced it in multiple organizations. And it is just, it's heartbreaking. It really is.
Yeah. I think the conclusion of your response there is the most powerful to me. Like, just a very simple action, even our presence, right, could be triggering and cause someone to move from, a state of comfort, right, to dysregulation, just like in the snap of a finger, in a second, a millisecond.
Right.
That's really important to think about. But it also makes me think, Shannon, ultimately, foundationally, we're clinicians, right? So we get that. We understand it to an extent, perhaps more than people who are in leadership positions in organizations that are not necessarily from a clinical background. So I think of, departments like there's HR, there's payroll, there's finance, there's transportation, right? There's business, there's just all different kinds of departments in any organization, right? Why is it important, Shannon, that regardless of our position, that us as leaders, that we understand trauma, even though we're not clinicians?
Right. And you just said it, leaders, we don't treat trauma, but we do shape the conditions that determine whether trauma is reinforced or repaired, that hurt or heal balance. So as leaders, we design schedules, accountability systems, annual assessments of, how they're doing their work, those evaluation processes, communication norms. And so those types of structures, like you mentioned too, they either support regulation and safety. And as leaders, we don't really think that deep, but, as we move towards becoming trauma informed, if we decide to take that choice, our structures that we develop, they either intensify stress and re-traumatization, they hurt or they heal. They can either help build or take from. And so, going back to the imbalance of power, I always think it's either one plane or the other. As a leader, we have to be in the middle in everything we do, construct, build, say. We have to build in that universal precaution that our workforce, even ourselves, may be struggling with trauma. And we have to be able to develop systems, process, policies that are trauma informed and have that universal precaution built into it so that we're not unintentionally triggering anybody at any time.
Yeah. I love that. You're giving so many good nuggets today. Universal precaution makes me think of universal care, right? Just coming from the healthcare background as well, but like universal precaution, right? So something that's, I think a lot about, Shannon, is compliance over healing. So an example might be, a parent just berated staff, and we're not really focusing on the healing versus the hurt, but all right, let's have a meeting to follow up, how we move forward. Like, this is what the parent wants, things like that. Or, we have this compliance deadline, or we have this IP, or whatever it is, and really, really overemphasizing the need for compliance, the need for following protocol, the need for following procedures, and really diminishing the importance of healing, the importance of talking to our staff to find out how they feel, how it impacted them. And, I have, several of those experiences that have happened in my career. And what happens, Shannon, whether it's us as supervisors, whether it's us as leaders, whether it's the system, whether it's the organization, really rewards and focuses on compliance versus healing? And
it's a great question. And so you're coming from a different mindset I'm coming from my experience working in local government and in, the mental health field. So it looks a little bit different because on my side, there is managed care, although I didn't work directly in the managed care company.
Right.
But I also worked with our court partners. And so when you look at different systems, different entities within human services or social services in all states, all types of local governments, there are certain aspects of compliance, rules, regulations that really create silos, right?
Yeah.
And so although there's certain ways of doing your job, which includes, making sure the community's safe, making sure there's access to early intervention, making sure there's access to mental health and substance use services. Where I kind of extract how trauma-informed care can be applicable there is it comes down to how you engage with others. And we have to simplify that is we may have to do compliance. We may have to engage and arrest individuals because they didn't meet their probation requirements, or an individual, is over here in front of the judge because of certain reasons. It doesn't take away what you have to do in terms of your rules and regulations of your systems, but what you can change and influence is how you engage with them, how you listen to them, how you're mirroring their body language when they're sitting next to you. I did a lot of work, over my career in a local government, and we trained all the judges multiple times in trauma-informed courtrooms. I also train court partners in how the criminal justice system, can be trauma-informed. And the bottom line there is don't focus on how you're going to use trauma-informed care in compliance or in your rules and regulations. It comes down to how am I talking to you? Or not to you, but how am I talking with you? How am I engaging with you? How am I offering you resources? Voice and choice is so important at this point in a lot of those more stringent types of compliant types of organizations, local government entities. We have a choice to heal or hurt. And do you want to come to work every day and heal and engage and speak to individuals with respect, or do you want to take from that? And there's a choice there. So I don't know if I answered your question, but there's opportunities. There's that word again. There's opportunities for systems to engage, the choice, the very minimum, engage individuals with respect and healthy engagement, or, not.
Yeah, no, I love that voice and choice. And, we have to make a choice, and then do we give them a voice, like to express their feelings, to say how they feel. And, it makes me think everything you're saying, you sort of started talking about, in my opinion, how trauma awareness, trauma-informed leadership, trauma-informed supervision really shifts the way we interpret leadership behaviors, but then how we implement them as well. So I think, from a behavior analytic perspective, everything you just said, then, something I might shift is, labeling, how this person feels, defining it, meeting their need, and then coaching them in the skills they need so they can adapt, and improve. So from your perspective and your experience, how does leaders becoming trauma aware, trauma informed, literate, trauma literate, as we talked about earlier, really shift the way that we interpret leadership behaviors, whether it's our behaviors or the behaviors of co-leaders?
We talked a little bit about it earlier is, one of the goals of becoming trauma competent or aware or trauma sensitive is to shift from what is wrong with the person to what's happened and what's happening now in this system. And, it reframes resistance as protection. disengagement as exhaustion, conflict as unmet safety needs, and really integrates that psychological safety. So many times, even through those little simple interactions, having that empathetic view or our trauma lens that we always talk about is looking at somebody as, what's happened to them as influencing how they're, interacting with us or not interacting with us. It opens up our eyes to be able to see there's maybe other alternatives to why they're behaving or engaging with us in a certain way, especially as a leader. We spoke about that earlier, is they may be coming in with a traumatic response. They're back here right now. And instead of personalizing it or saying, they're being resistant to feedback, or that individual isn't following their treatment plan, because when we have that trauma lens and we see that it's those early childhood adversities causing those interactions or lack of interactions, we shift our mindset, and that helps to protect the individual from system-induced trauma, and it also creates that opportunity to model as a leader the proper way of engaging with others through that universal precaution that everybody has or is going through trauma.
Yeah. I appreciate that. So then, having said that, Shannon, what I think of professional relationships, right? And I think of, it could be an open, it could be closed, it could be one where your door is open, people can walk in and ask questions, where you're on the floor, where you're visible. And where you engage in, conversations really, really founded and grounded in curiosity. Like, you really want to learn, about what the individual, and it builds that relationship. Yesterday in my conversation for this podcast, we talked about trust, right, as something that's so important, and building trusting relationships. So what role do you believe professional relationships and organizational culture play in contributing to toxic stress? And from everything you've said, how can you sum up, what are some things, how can we shift our behaviors so we're not contributing to that toxic stress?
Right. And you're spot on, because organizations where that top down does not prioritize addressing that toxic stress, it leaks, as I mentioned, into all facets, including the service delivery, whatever the organization, provides. As I said, everyone in that organization has an opportunity. There's that opportunity word again, to choose to be trauma informed, to choose to heal or to hurt. And so sometimes, when the top does not do this, and I've seen it happen, those mid managers do step in. I usually call them the trauma informed champions, but that is not sustainable because they can only take so much. I think leaders that engage in high surveillance of their staff, unclear expectations, not providing clarity, inconsistent leadership increases that probability that toxic stress is going to be present. We know leaders that create opportunities for predictability, transparency, that relational trust that you can build through trauma-informed supervision, actually reduces stress, even at that biological level. Like just walking in and seeing your supervisor who you feel safe, you have that psychological safety with, really creates that you to be regulated, right? But then you can walk into another room and you're right back here with that other person. And so that's why it really comes down to that individual choice sometimes, because not all organizations are going to buy it. What's trauma-informed care? And I've integrated it in my professional experience, from first responder community to a local government, to all types, from elected officials to judges to the court system. And, it can work. And when it works, it changes the organization. It protects those that we're serving. It increases the workforce resilience. It saves organizations money, just by simply engaging with people respectfully and understanding that there's that universal precaution. And so organizations are always like, well, what's the bottom line for me? Well, the bottom line is cost containment, is money you'll be saving, because
Yes.
staff aren't calling out. You're not having to pay individuals
Right.
to come in for overtime. You're building that trauma-informed environment, and it in this day of cost saving, I think all organizations, people, leaders that run it, elected
Yes.
officials, whoever they are, want to see the benefits of organizations that either engage in traumatic stress.
Yeah.
You're going to have a lot of call outs, a lot of turnover,
Yeah.
recidivism, and you'll be spending a lot of money on the startup of staff versus, preserving good quality staff that have
Yeah.
a career, it's longevity in their roles, and have compassion, satisfaction. So,
Yeah.
do you want to have toxic stress, or do you want to be trauma informed? It's a determination. Leaders have to determine what culture they want to have.
Yeah. And from all of that, I take away return on investment, right? We
Yes.
invest in trauma-informed organizations. We invest in trauma-informed care. We invest in trauma literacy. We invest in trauma training and professional development, and we'll see the returns. Just as you're saying, that line is going to trend upwards, right? And we'll have productivity. We'll have staff who want to work. We'll have staff who are present. And then our clients, whoever our clients are, would then feel like they're receiving high quality service and high quality treatment. So I'm so happy for everything you shared. I took away a lot for myself personally, I'm going to be honest. To wrap up our conversation today, from everything you shared with us, Shannon, they were so rich. You gave us so many thoughts: heal, hurt, boy's choice, right? Things like that, opportunity. What's one core idea that the listeners for this episode should really hold on to on a daily basis?
As a leader, I think this statement should resonate with those that want to integrate trauma-informed principles. Leadership is nervous system leadership. I think that's deep.
That is deep.
That is, I think
Leadership is nervous system leadership. Ooh, I love that.
Isn't it interesting?
Yes.
Because we have a responsibility.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility in whatever type of organization we're a leader in to make sure that it is welcoming, it is safe, it is, providing high quality services that are respectful, welcoming. And so when we have that, I guess it's a responsibility.
Yeah.
It's a leadership responsibility to be able to, support regulation that leads to dignity, respect. We're helping to deepen those survival responses in our workforce, but also in those that we're helping. I also think, like, when leaders respond with knowledge, compassion, accountability, we don't lower standards. We create conditions where people can actually meet them. Trauma is healed through relationships. We all have a choice to be trauma-informed. To heal or to hurt is a choice in our professional and personal relationships. Here's another great one that I like to say. Regulation is not a soft skill. It's a leadership infrastructure.
I love that. Regulation is not a soft skill. It's a leadership infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And sustainability change requires accountability and nervous system safety.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that kind of summarizes it all.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Nervous system safety. I enjoy this conversation very much, Shannon. I'm actually absolutely looking forward to our, second session in our 3-episode conversation. So thank you so much. You gave me so much knowledge, so much insight, right? To take away, to implement for myself, for my staff, for those that I lead, even those in my personal lives as well. And so I'm definitely looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.
You too. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Behaviorally Speaking, Leadership for Changemakers. And Shannon, thank you for sharing your experiences on today's episode. Leadership lives in our daily behavior, in how we listen, how we respond, and how we create space for others to grow. Today, Shannon reminded us that leadership is nervous system leadership, that every interaction can heal or hurt, that adopting a universal precaution mindset to a trauma changes culture, and that regulation isn't a soft skill, it's a leadership infrastructure. She explained that when we regulate first, we create the conditions for dignity, accountability, and performance. She reminded us that trauma literacy shifts us from asking, "What's wrong with you?" to "What's happened to you?" And perhaps most importantly, she emphasized that leaders don't treat trauma, but we absolutely shape the conditions that determine whether trauma is reinforced or repaired. If you have a story about leadership and behavior from your community, share it with us. If this episode resonated, share it with someone, and check out our companion blog, Behaviorally Speaking, Insights for Changemakers at esthercbubabservices.com/blog. For training, coaching, and behavior-based leadership supports, visit esthercbubabservices.com. Until next time, lead with humanity and purpose. Practice with compassion and intention, and create meaningful, lasting change. This is Dr. Bub. Stay inspired.